Hi, the 1492 guy. We're going to look at some catchphrases today that we use, Western civilization, or at least in our country. And starting with some of these I call CBC-isms. CBC is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is in Canada. Fantastic organization, but they do fall into many of the traps as well too. These CBC-isms. So some of these are those types that you'll hear during the newscasts, and not to pick on CBC, any newscast. They're built into our lingo, into our lexicon, into the way we talk and the way we think. And we have this cultural conditioning from when we were little, and these things just pop out into our thinking without us really even being aware of it, some of them. So language is lost. Now, we look at the indigenous and we talk about that, and we grow up with this idea that, well, their language was lost. And we hear about could be in South America, it could be somewhere in the Mesoamerican civilizations, when we think about that big pyramid behind me, and there's a few stragglers left generations later today, and we say, well, their languages were lost. Certainly we hear it in North America, we hear it in Canada, we hear it in the Southeast, in the United States, pretty well everywhere. The languages were lost, and it gives this impression, it's a mental image of they were kind of a little bit careless, right? There was somebody had the log book for this stuff, and then they just they left it sitting on a tree stump somewhere, and they took off and went swimming, and it was lost. And that's the way it went. So not only were the languages not lost, they were in every case driven away as the genocidal procedures that have been laid out by the UN, that yes, that word's appropriate. The languages were driven away in extreme cases in the 1500s by the Spanish, where they burned all the books and made it against the law to speak your language, right up into some more tame type of examples in the North or in South America, where they were just made very, very difficult to practice anything cultural, recreational, spiritual, language. Dark period. Well, when something happens and they're looking at the truth and reconciliation problems, examples, the things that happened, for example, kidnappings, 60s scoop, the residential schools, could be any number of stories. And it's normally, we prefer to think of it as kind of a one-off. Like everything's pretty good. We're very nice people. And then there was this one little blemish, this dark period in our history. But of course, the entire history is dark. Every 15 or 20 years, going back for hundreds of years, you can see examples of dark things happening, of blemishes, of things that would be an embarrassment to any civilized society to fess up to and to just glare at and study in detail as to exactly what happened there. So there's no dark period in Canadian history or American history. The whole thing is dark if you want to look at it in that way. Normally where you'll hear this example is something like trying to resolve a residential school situation, making apologies to the indigenous. Yeah, we all want to make this kind of a sigh of relief, and it's all behind us now. And that is not the case. It's not going to happen. Don't look forward to that. We don't have a racist problem. Well, this goes beyond indigenous matters. And as I said, just being all culturally conditioned as youngsters. Yeah, culturally conditioned. I was culturally conditioned to say in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. As all my baby boomer audiences certainly can scream that out without just automatically triggered. Also, what about I discriminate against people? I'm biased. I have racist thoughts. I'll have racist activities unless I'm extremely, extremely careful. I caused a genocide here in my home territory. Well, we should be conditioned with those things, but we're not exactly conditioned to say that. But If you're not anti-racist, then you're racist, because racism is the type of thing where it's always pointed to another group, the next group. Well, no, I'm not racist. Look at so-and-so. What's that got to do with it? If you have racist thoughts, you have racist thoughts. We all have racist thoughts. You have to own that. So this idea that we don't have a racism problem, I mean, that's classic Canadian too, where we're so proud of our multiculturalism, but we haven't dealt with it nearly as much as even in America, where they're really preoccupied with the black and the white situation, and that's not going away anytime soon either. So get past this and really begin a period of reconciliation. That's like my other example where I said the dark period. These CBC-isms, these little radio-isms, these little catchphrases, you don't necessarily hear them in our everyday lexicon like some of the ones we're going to get into, but you do hear them from some of the authorities, the powers that be, the newscasters. And they like that one like this. Okay, we get past this. There's been something in the news for a few weeks now. The report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is out, and there's all of these recommendations, and lots of recommendations, none of which usually get brought in, or none of the important ones. And then afterwards, it's another one of these, well, the news cycle is passing on that particular item now, which has been around for a couple of years. And the idea is we want to get past this. And it's uncomfortable for people. Of course they want to get past it and really begin a period of reconciliation. They haven't really dealt with any truth, just like in my example of that missing Indigenous women and girls, where what became a news cycle toward the end of that was using the word genocide. And people in North America, they don't want to hear that word. Genocide is something that happens over there in Africa with the boiling pots and pygmies and one tribe, butchering the other tribe with a bunch of machetes, and that's what genocide is, right? They don't want to look at the UN. They'll read the UN thing, but it doesn't penetrate. We don't want it to penetrate. It's too painful to realize that that's what we've been doing all along. We're doing it every day. And that's another example, reconciliation. The truth is a little too painful, it's on the painful side. So we want to jump right to this. We can get past this and really begin a period of reconciliation. We want to roll up our sleeves and really get the reconciliation. Okay, Indigenous, go, get it going there, the reconciliation. Come on, let's move this along. That's kind of the feeling. Okay, standing in the way of progress. And somebody who is trying to preserve something, whether it be their culture, their heritage, their way of life, something in nature perhaps that is about to get a lot of mercury inserted into it over the next 100 years. Could be a number of things, but standing in the way of progress is a great little image where you could picture the person there. They've got their feet apart and their hands up like this, and I've got a hand there somewhere, and they're standing in the way of progress. And so, anyway, I'll skip over that image. You get the idea. Indian corn. I grew up with that. This Indian corn. Now, the fact is there was over 300 different types of corn that the Indigenous had, and it was the most, not only is it the one plant in agriculture that scientists have never found the root plant for. They have a theory about it, but it's not provable like with all other plants. It's also the only food that requires man before it can really reproduce, because the seeds from a corn, they can't reproduce on their own in nature. They basically need mankind to pull back those husks. They also had 300 different types of corns. There's only a few of them that became widespread and are in use today, including that one that the white man claims to have discovered in the 20th century, the hybrid corns. Those were all known to the Indigenous. Indian corn was the thing that contrasted with the little yellow, the bright yellow ones that we grew up with, and the standardized. Of course, all of our fruit and vegetables are very beautiful looking today, and they've been bred that way, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then in contrast to the yellow, sweet yellow corn, there was these ones that had all purple, yellow, and different colors of corn, and they were used for decoration. They weren't considered to be real corn. You didn't use the corn. You brought them out at Halloween or in the fall, and they were to look at. And they were usually hardened at that point, which you might do for cattle or something like that. But in other words, the message is it's not something you can eat. All the kernels are hardened and it's been turned into a decoration. That was always called Indian corn. Well, this was the idea that the white man came over here, of course, and taught the Indian agriculture. That's a whole 8-hour course right there, because that would be funny if it wasn't so tragic when you could read that in a history book. Not so much anymore, thankfully. And so not only they came over and taught them agriculture, but that gives this impression that, yes, the one gift from the indigenous in the Western Hemisphere that we trot out all the time is corn, but we still manage to degrade it and denigrate it in this way by having this Indian corn. Well, here's our corn. Look at this. This stuff is great. There's the Indian corn. Well, it's kind of fun, you know. We just it's fun. That's the Indian type corn. You can't eat it. You just look at it. Okay, Indian corn. Indian treaties. That's a good one. I'd forgotten about that one. Indian treaties. Of course, there's no such thing as an Indian treaty. They're all colonial treaties. And I guess we like to think that it was a 50-50 proposition. And at the time, I'm sure there's people on both sides who felt it was a 50-50 proposition. I think there's probably more 80 or 90% on the colonial side felt it was a 50-50 proposition. And maybe 20-30% on the indigenous side felt it was a 50-50 proposition. But over time, they're all proving to be quite illegal documents and immoral documents and unethical documents. And pretty much, I think the United Nations and Supreme Courts in North America all can agree on that. But calling them Indian treaties is another example of, well, how did they happen to get called that? Well, it's because through the colonial lens, we have our stuff going on, we have our trains, we have the economy, and then there's the Indians over here, right? The Indian problem, the Indian category, the Indian Act, or the Indian treaties. They're just land treaties is what they were, and they're a way to steal all the land. And so Indian land versus Crown land. There's another one. That's my last one. I'll let you guys go. But Indian land versus Crown land. Well, this is a lens type of situation. It reinforces the lens that we use. And we want to look at this stuff as Indian land. Well, there's the Indian land. It's official. That's where they go. That's Indian land. The rest of it is Crown land, or it's our land. And Crown land, well, the Queen owns about 80% of Canada. And United States, I mean, they got a separate set of problems over there. And I mentioned the Canadian one because I'm in Canada. But the Crown land is like everything that got left over that's not Indian land. Well, really, it's all Indian land. It was stolen and taken from them. So this idea that now it can be designated as Indian land are these little parcels, these little blocks that have been distributed, which is 0.2% in Canada of the total land, compared to they actually have 5% of our population today. And they have 0.2%. Even in the United States, they have 2% of all the land. Now let's remember the percent that they actually had before Europeans came over and decided that they were going to steal the whole thing. They had 100% of the land. I mean, that doesn't take a mathematician to figure that one out. Okay, so 0.2% of the land, but that's Indian land. So all these little blocks that limit growth to forever. Don't we all grow? Don't cities grow? Hasn't Toronto and Vancouver, haven't they grown? If you drew a line and said, okay, this is it, in the next 200 years you can't go past here, you know, well, what kind of a society, what kind of a community do you end up with there compared to the ones that flourish in Toronto and Vancouver now, because there's some idea that you can grow. So these little parcels of land, these little, in most cases, they were close to concentration camps, even up into my lifetime, where you needed a permission from the Indian agent in a particular card before you could even leave the area. Okay, so that's Indian land that we call Indian land. It's really these communities that have been set up and enforced upon them by the umbrella colonial organization. Nothing to do with reality. They're just labels. They're colonial labels. Indian land and Crown land. Okay, so there you go. That's some of my biases. Now, laying it out. That's just a few of these interesting little terms that we use that are built into our lexicon. All right, we'll see you next time around. You take care.